Hello and welcome to Culture Conversations. I'm Craig Foreman, your guide through the ever-evolving world of organizational culture. Here we engage in real, unscripted conversations with the changemakers actively shaping our workplaces. From innovative strategies to heartfelt insights, each conversation is a step towards making work better for us all. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Culture Conversations. Hello and thank you for joining us today on Culture Conversations. Today's guest is Emily Goodson. Emily is currently the founder of Culture Smart, where she consults and specializes in building inclusive workplaces and addressing systemic talent challenges, particularly around human resources and the recruiting functions. She also has a history of leading people teams. She's been a people leader, and early in her life, something very important to know about Emily is that she suffered a brain injury that led to partial paralysis on the left side of her body. Her journey in living with this disability and recovery has left her with a powerful desire to educate and empower others. She has gone on to be a prolific creator. She's written for the LA Times. She's openly discussing the challenges in her life, but particularly the challenges of intimacy and disability. So talk about that courage to be vulnerable and put yourself out there to help inform and inspire others. Personally, we first met at an event that was hosted for Culture Amp for senior HR leaders, and she came there. And I clearly remember seeing her for the first time and feeling a real pull to want to get to know and learn more about this person, which we did, got to know her. And then when building the Culture First community, I reached out and said, Emily, would you help? She went on to help us launch the LA and San Diego chapters and was such a powerhouse in all of that and inspired me every day. I've built content with her, I've presented with her, I've interviewed her, I've talked to her in challenging times, and she's just one of those people. Every time we speak, I walk away inspired and enlightened, and I knew that I had to have her on this here on Culture Conversations. So today, what are we going to talk about? We talk about the journey of self-discovery and professional evolution. We talk about vulnerability and empowerment through sharing your own journey with others. And we talk about enhancing the workplace practices through creating inclusivity. So I couldn't be more honored to share my conversation with this incredibly influential and important person in my world. Welcome, my friend, Emily Goodson. Emily, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm great, Craig. How are you doing?
I am well. I'm excited. I am, as you know, building a business and going through all the stuff that I think I'm supposed to be going through in that journey. And one of those, I think, was the idea of content and getting out there more and creating this podcast.
I love it.
Just connecting with people and having conversations. And you were top of mind for me, of course. So we've done a lot of work together, but it's awesome to look. Any opportunity to see your face is great, but it's awesome to be here with you.
I know. I have been looking forward to this because it's one of those things where it's like, this doesn't even feel like recording a podcast, right? It feels like I'm just chatting with a friend, just catching up.
Yay. That's a great plug. That's exactly what we're trying to do. I know I feel the same way. And every time we connect, I have so many wonderful memories along the years. So, and I guess that's a good segue to say, gosh, I feel like we first met, in 2018 or 19 in New York.
19.
We were running, Culture Amp was running an event for senior HR leaders, and you were there, and that's where we met, which I think is interesting because I met you directly in the HR space. You were leading people team, but your journey has taken you so many unique places since. So maybe that's a good place to start off, is just, catch everybody up on who you are and what you do. And then I know we're going to have a great conversation.
Yeah. No, it is kind of wild to think that we met, I think it was May 2019, April 2019. And, life takes us on all kinds of unexpected turns. And what happened after we met in New York is I ended up going out on my own as a consultant and an advisor. Moved to California as part of that transition, and did consulting and continued to do consulting throughout the pandemic, and really focused that consulting in the HR space. So really focused it on helping startups scale culture, and that had been my expertise that I had grown up in. And I think during the pandemic, I also spent a lot of time, as many of us did, doing some deep introspection about who I am and what my real purpose is here in the world. And as part of that, I did some internal reconciliation of, I have had a physical disability for the past 30 years and never really dug into that as much as I should and talked about that. And so came out of the pandemic, still doing consulting. And right now I really focus my consulting on kind of customized manager trainings and speaking engagements. But in addition to that, I do some writing and creative projects around disability, specifically the intersection between disability and intimacy. So it has been quite the 180 from the HR leader you met.
I mean, you've lived it, but just, to be somebody that's known you and been close to you, it's been these moments along the way. I think for me, the big one was, and I think this is important part of the story, right? That in your journey to write, you wrote an article that got picked up by the LA Times, and that was a pretty big game changer. Yeah.
It was a big game changer. And it's one of those, I'm smiling, right? I mean, if you can't tell through the audio, I have a big grin on my face. It was a big game changer. And that was one of those moments where, like, I have a very vivid memory of sitting at the table in my outside my apartment in Santa Monica. I was sitting at my patio table. I remember submitting it. And then I remember getting the email. I submitted it in it was September 2021. And, I submitted it because, all of these newspapers have just general inboxes that you can submit things to. And most of the times you don't get a response. So I submitted it and I kind of forgot about it. And then I remember the exact moment in January 22, I had just gotten my hair cut and I checked my email and they said, we want to publish this. And I will never forget those two moments. They are very cemented in my mind forever. I know, so special. And I'm so grateful to the LA Times for, elevating my voice and, and the voices of others, who have been in the same situation as me, and just haven't written an article like I have.
I judge, but I think you'd agree with me that there's a ton of vulnerability in there, and which probably it's hard for all of us, particularly. But I know you're talking about intimacy, you're talking about the disability, and he just in reflection, because I think we both agree that courage to be vulnerable is so important, but also until that day you hadn't submitted it, we all have faced these things. Any thoughts or things you'd reflect on others, in the space, or the power of vulnerability, or it's catching me as the level of vulnerability required to do that, but then the outcome that you received, we're all talking about on the other side, but just what you'd share with people that are wanting to change the world or having a lived experience, just that the idea of vulnerability and what it means.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. My first thing I want to say that comes to mind is not everyone has to exhibit the same level of vulnerability that I did. And it is not for everyone, and nor should it be. And so, for me, I felt very called to write that article because I had, done this tremendous work on myself. And I had, it was honestly harder for me to be vulnerable with people one-on-one in my personal life than it was the LA Times. And and I say that with a little bit of an eye roll at myself, because it's submitting the article was not hard. Sending it to LA Affairs at LA Times, whatever the email address was, that was not hard. In the days leading up to the publication, that's when I really was oh my God, what is about to happen? But that level of vulnerability, is not required of everyone, and not everyone should feel calm to it. I think that's one of the big takeaways I have, and then I talk about in workplaces a lot is, everyone's on their own time frame, and it took me honestly 30 years to be able to be that vulnerable with anyone. And this is, it's a journey. And so I don't yes, it took a lot of courage for me to exhibit that level of vulnerability. I feel like that's, my mission right now is to be very vulnerable with some of my experiences because it helps others. But it's not everyone's purpose in life. So that's, I think, a big kind of takeaway of that whole process.
That you don't do what's right for you, your time, your place, your space. I do think I think of the people out there that how many people want to share their voice and, scared about the vulnerability or, so the encouragement for those that do feel that calling, that want to make a difference and just thinking about how to move forward.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I had done a lot of work on myself to be ready to share that voice. Mm-hmm. And what that meant is digging into a lot of the shame and guilt and nasty thoughts about myself that I had, like really digging into that and coming out the other side. Yeah. And I'm not saying you have to do that in order to share your voice, but it helps. Because there were plenty of worst case scenarios I came up with in my head of like, oh my God, so-and-so is going to read this and they're going to then do this, or so, I'm not going to get hired again as an HR consultant because of this article, right? It's a very, very vulnerable space when you're sharing your personal story and voice. And so I think for me, having done some of that inner work on really being grounded in who I am, that was helpful. And I think, the LA Times did a good job of supporting me, right? Like I was very involved in the editing process. Like I was proofing everything. I was, as much as I could be, they really involved me, which I think is super important. And I've actually done some workshops since with media companies about, as people are publishing, different accounts, whether it's, a magazine or, a newspaper or, like in TV and film, as we're showing more voices, as we're showcasing more voices and their experiences, what do we need to do to support those people? Because, sometimes when you are retelling a personal story, you're reliving the trauma to some extent if you're talking about trauma. And, I think it's an interesting question of as a publication or as a production company that's doing that, what support are you providing to your authors or to your actors or, whomever? Because it takes a lot of courage, and a lot of stuff can come up in the process.
That's a really great point. And as you're talking, to pull it back focused a little bit on, because bridging these two worlds that you're in now, the media world and all that. But I think also in our workplaces, right? You talk about the media, we're bringing more voices alive. We're opening up to more voices. So are we, it seems like, in our workplaces, and we're asking, so like if we talk about courage to be vulnerable, we published an article, but like, let's bring it back to the workplace where we're asking people to step up more, to talk more, to be more open and authentic. Are there things that translate that you've learned that we can bring in the workplace, that are parallels to how do we support people as we are moving into a new way of being, as we're asking, or people are wanting to share more? Some of those same themes that can apply to how we support our employees.
Yeah, there's so many parallels, and I think it's when I go into workplaces, I was just doing a manager training, series of manager trainings the other week for a company, and a couple of the things I told them are, you cannot expect everyone to disclose what's going on with them. And you cannot expect everyone to want to do that. Like, I think that's, as you said at the top of this conversation, it's like you do you, and you share what you're prepared to share when the time comes. And we have to know that everyone's on their own journey. At the same time, we have to create workplaces where people do feel they can speak up and they have outlets, right? And, I think a parallel we can draw there with my story is, what are those diverse outlets? Like what is the range of outlets provided? Meaning some people are going to be comfortable speaking up in a survey. Some people are going to be comfortable speaking up to a coach. As I was for years, I worked with executive coaches, and I would tell them things and work on things with them that I would not tell another living soul, and we have to have, it's funny, I'm doing or not funny, it's timely. I'm doing a presentation next week for a company on building psychological safety. And so I've been really digging into Amy Edmondson's work, around this. And she talks in her book about Wells Fargo is kind of a textbook example of, there was no psychological safety. And so, they got into fraudulent practices because people didn't speak up. And then she also, talks about, we are now living and have lived, all of these awful, toxic and harassing behaviors happened, 10, 25 years ago, and nobody felt safe enough to speak up about them at the time. Like, none of that is okay. And so it's like, we have to create environments where people feel they can speak up about things like that, and they have the outlet to do it. At the same time, if we're talking on another level about my disability and, how it affects me, that's not something we can necessarily, expect everyone to speak up about, if that makes sense. It's almost like different levels of, what people are talking about.
Well, I'm having this as you're speaking. I'm just thinking about my lived experience particularly around facilitation, and that, when we say creating cultures of belonging and acceptance, sometimes I think we have to open that up. Doesn't mean belonging and acceptance for just those that are doing it the way you want. Is there a place for belonging and acceptance of those that don't speak up, that want to be quiet? And I think about doing group work, and I'm early on, if somebody wasn't participating or sitting outside the circle or wasn't, it used to be, it would trigger me as a facilitator. Am I doing a good job? And I think part of my journey was come to realize, cool, that's where they are right now. And I've heard so many times from people in those situations afterwards saying, thank you for letting me just watch. I know it might have seemed one way, but I got so much from watching. I wasn't ready to be participatory. And I think it's just that aha, for to every leader out there, is, what does it mean to belonging and acceptance for the ones that you struggle with, not the ones that's so easy, the person that's not engaged, the person that's, being contradictory, what does belonging and acceptance mean for everybody? And I think sometimes it's great when it fits, but if it doesn't, or if that person's triggering you, if that person doesn't want to participate, but that's about you. And sometimes the most powerful experiences sometimes people just need to observe and watch. They're not ready, but if they witness other people being vulnerable in a safe way, they will, or they won't.
Yeah. And that's very much been the takeaway from my journey. I wasn't ready. I was not ready for, 20 some years to have, conversation. And we talk about this, I kind of straddle.
It makes sense where you're coming from now too. Based on your lived experiences, what you're saying is don't push anybody. You're ready when you're ready.
Don't push anybody. You're ready when you're ready. And it's, it's I, for 20 years, didn't want to talk about my disability with anyone. And, we can dig into that in a separate conversation, but it's yes, I see that now, looking back, I see the parallels between my personal and professional life, right? I remember, I had a very hard time with conflict. In general, in my 20s, and I would get very, very upset about, not trying to speak up and not being able to speak up, or being silenced, or, and it's now looking at that, you're like, okay, well, there were clearly some things I was processing, and, but it's, you can't push people to be ready before they're ready. You just can't.
Yeah. you said something earlier and you just brought it back. So I think it's a neat segue, and honestly, it's a curiosity. So I met you, you have a visible disability. So I saw that you had disability, and when you don't live with somebody, like time seems to move pretty quickly. Before I knew it, I was watching you talk about this. So I just always assumed that it was always incorporated. Now, as I'm hearing you recount your story, I realized when I met you, that's not where you were. So number one, it's a little bit like, it's interesting as the story expands for me. But I think one of the questions I have for you is, as an HR leader at the time, in that transition that I now know happened, I did not realize that. What shifted for you? How did you see things differently from accessibility, organizational perspective? Any just ahas as you were ready to talk about it more, work on it in a position of leadership and working with organizations at that level? I had that curiosity when I realized that there was that change for you that I didn't quite know had happened.
Yeah. And so two thoughts on that, because the first, I think I want to highlight what you just said and tie it back to that earlier question you had about, for people who are ready to like step up and be vulnerable on a national stage, like what's a piece of advice? Craig just said it. Like, people assume you have been that way for your whole life. Mm-hmm. And maybe you have, but I wasn't. And, I can think of a particular person who I met right before I wrote, like right as I was starting to write the article, and then as it was published. And, right around the time it was published, he made a joke, a very sarcastic joke, and it triggered me big time. And I was very upset. It was about something about disability and intimacy. And after the fact, once I kind of checked myself the next day, I was like, hey, like, I don't think you meant to trigger me by that, but like that really upset me because it's taken me a long time to get to a place where I can talk about this. And he hadn't known me for years. Like, he didn't know the progression. And so I think that's just a takeaway, I think, for people who are stepping into this work is like, somebody told me once, like, you see the athletes on the medal podium, right? Like, you see them getting the bronze and the gold, but you don't know all the stuff that went into that. So it's, that's been a big learning for me is like, it's almost, I talk a lot about myself in like Emily, like 2.0, 3.0, and almost before and after the article, because they're different people and most people don't know the transition. So we'll put a pin in that. But then I think your question about, as I went through this transition, like, working with companies, what are my takeaways? I think it dawned on me right at the start of the pandemic. I think I was thinking too small. And, I did a lot of great work as an HR leader in-house. And I left, to do my consulting business because I wanted to have a bigger impact. And I still wasn't quite thinking big enough. And I think what dawned on me, or, sort of this pivotal moment, is I was actually at an event in San Diego that I was putting on with Culture Amp, funny enough, which is, we also met at a Culture Amp event. And we were talking about engagement and talking about diversity and inclusion and belonging. And after the event, a Latino woman came up to me and she said, it is just so moving to me to see somebody like you up on that stage who gets it and can speak for people like me, and my needs. And it just really took me back. Like, it really, like, I was, it was one of those moments of like, I have the privilege of being in rooms and on stages and in spaces where people will listen to me, and I need to do justice for people, like I need to like honor that. And like part of honoring that is learning as much as I can about people from different backgrounds than me, learning about the spectrum of disability, learning about, one of the things I'm doing right now is I have a presentation coming up in a couple of weeks about intimacy and disability. Particularly like the audience for this is like people on movie sets and on film sets. And, one of the big things that goes through my mind is like, I don't want to do a disservice to the people who can't speak for themselves or aren't ready for it. And so I'm doing a lot of reading about, visible disabilities, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, this whole spectrum and the intersections here, what does it mean to be a racial minority with a disability? And I know I can't cover everything or do everyone justice, but I do think a big takeaway in this transition for me has been, I have this platform to some extent, and I don't want to do a disservice to people who can't or aren't ready to speak for themselves when I can help elevate what matters to them or what needs.
Like the power of privilege, like in so many
cases,
now you have the privilege and the power that comes along with it of having a platform. It's easy sometimes to be like, well, I earned it or this or that, but like the responsibility and seeing it as the privilege that you have and what do you want to do with that privilege versus just take it for granted. And I also love hearing, I think you're a reminder to everybody that we all have room to grow, that no matter where you think you are in some journey or how expertise you think you have, is there something you'd share in this recent research, anything you've learned more recently, an aha for you around accessibility, disability, just, what's, is there something new in your reading and research that you're like, that's a powerful new idea or something I'm really chewing on?
Well, I mean, what I was reading earlier today is, so the Netflix just came out with a mini series adaptation of All the Light We Cannot See. And it's based on a book, and there you can look this up. CBS Sunday Morning, I think, has some good content around this. But they had a I think he calls himself an accessibility consultant, but somebody who came in and helped the blind actors on that set navigate and make sure that the presentation, the portrayal of the story was authentic. And there's so many parallels as I put together this training of, I think in general, media is, catching up on telling different stories and be more diverse in who they hire, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I'm talking to them about like, think ahead about, is your set accessible for people? Do you have, audio descriptions? Do you have, captions on, when you're doing a presentation, those are the same things in, corporate workplaces, right? It's not that different. And so, I think sometimes we tend to think like, oh, tech is behind or Hollywood's behind, or, it's like, no, we're all behind.
This is behind.
We're all behind. And it's, it's how can we, how can we just give people those basic supports? And it's back to what we talked about earlier. It's that balance of like, we know some people aren't ready to speak up for themselves. So how can we have some just across the board? We use captions on all of our Zooms, or, across the board, we make sure there's a ramp into the office building. Across the board, we're giving people breaks during the day,
Emma, I have daughters, but I've noticed, I think it's more popular with younger people, but they keep captions on all the time.
Yeah.
And so captions are on a lot at our house.
Yeah.
And I used to turn them off. It honestly helps me follow along better, and it helps them follow. And again, it's just this opening of just simply keep them on. It helps them. My younger one, I think, follow better if she can't. It's just so interesting that it's not, closed caption just for those that couldn't hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, how about if you're dyslexic or you're having a hard time processing the information quickly enough, or the different.
Yeah. I have them on my TV all the time too, because it helps me. And It's funny. When I applied to college way back in the day,
8 years ago, I know. Gosh, it's only
well,
been up for 4 years.
the essay prompt was, what is one thing that we do now that people will look back on in 20 years and think that was wild, right? So antiquated. And that essay prompt sticks with me. I mean, I think about it all the time because I feel like, something like captions, right? It's like, why is it such a big deal? Like, why is it such a big deal to have it on all the time? And I don't get it. And if it helps people, it's like, I don't, so
I think people don't. There's somewhere subtle that people don't want to feel inadequate. And if I turn them off, that means I don't need extra support, right? This individualism, I don't need help. I can go it alone. If I need help, I'm weak. That's what I think. That's the story we tell ourselves.
Yeah, it is the story we tell ourselves. It's a story I told myself for a long time.
It's it's probably particularly in our culture. I mean, it's a lot of culture, but more individualistic cultures. That's probably something that's propagated, and it gets in there deep. So it drives some of our decision making at levels that we don't always understand. Hey, I'm curious before we wrap. Gosh, time always flies. But tell me a little bit about the trainings you're doing with organizations right now. Like, what are you going in? What are these trainings like?
Yeah, no, they're great. I've been doing custom people manager trainings, and usually I start those out with a self-assessment on strengths, because I think, I'm just such a big fan of self-assessments and data, as I know you are. And so I usually start out with like, what are your strengths? What are the perceptions of that? What are the pros and cons of that? How do you utilize that as a manager? And then we go into emotional intelligence and feedback, and psychological safety is a lot of times what I cover. And then, depending on the organization, like I have an organization I'm working with in January, and their managers are very new to managing. And so we actually are going to get into like the tactics of like onboarding and recruiting and offboarding. Because that's, if we're talking about belonging and inclusion and acceptance, like onboarding and recruiting, that's where you got to get it right, And so we talk about in your interview email, like when you're inviting people to interview, like how can you from the get-go say, if you need an interpreter in this interview, please email us ahead of time, or if you don't put the onus on them to say, oh, I need this, because some people are going to feel a lot of shame around that. How can you set yourself up as a company, that you're offering?
Also, and I'm scared I don't say it's not virtue signaling, but if you're really doing that, I think, I talked a lot to people about employer branding. I talked to Marta Riggins on one of our podcasts around employer branding, and it's always looked at as this big, robust marketing effort. Like, how about that in your email? Even for the person that doesn't need it, what have you said about your organization? Who are we? What do we stand for? What are we about? And if you're that kind of environment, you're going to let people know beforehand, this is the kind of place we are. Maybe if you don't like that, if it's too whatever, then like, fine. Like, but right. we're signaling from day one, this is what we're about.
100%. Yeah, 100%. That's what, companies should be doing. And yeah, if that's who you are as a company, like I'm all about like, let's be authentic about who we are as companies or people and put it out there. And also recognize it may not be for everyone, and that's okay. Like I'm not for everyone, and that's okay.
Okay with that. If we keep trying to build a world that's okay for everybody all the time, and Priya Parker talks about it in The Art of Gathering, which I love because she goes head on and go like, building these kinds of communities and groups and can be exclusive, but we have to be intentionally exclusive. Why? Who's it for? Who's it not? And I think that word it's such a bad word. And I think it's an okay word if we're being intentional. It's when we're being exclusive through bias or through things that we're not being aware of. But to say this is who we are and who we're not, and if this works for you, great. And if it doesn't, like we just want to, this is what we're building.
Yeah. And also acknowledging that communities are for people in different stages, right? Like I may be at a certain stage where I need to be a part, I'm a good fit for this community. And then it may be that I transition, to a different career or to, I get married or whatever, and, then it's another community is appropriate for me. So I think it's
allow people to evolve and adapt. And sometimes it's right for a moment. Oh, there's a saying I always think about: friends for a reason, friends for a season, friends for life. And I think, the same thing holds true. Like sometimes there's relationships that are right at the right time. Some are for life, some are for a moment, and some are a little longer. So Emily, I'm looking at the time. If I knew it would. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, do work with you, how can they find out more about you?
I would love that. My website is ecgoodson.com. You can email me at emily@ecgoodson.com. You may also, people see that my LLC is named Culture Smart. And so, you may see that around too. And, as we talk about evolution and transitions, that's like one I'm working through right now. Is I have a bigger website devoted to Emily Goodson, but I'm still doing Culture Smart HR work. So
to anybody out there that's listening to this, Emily's one of my most favorite human beings ever, between the lived experience and the professional experience, just all the goodness. So I hope that some people reach out. And we've even been talking about how Emily can do her work and that I can support through helping bring in measurement. So we're measuring and showing the impact. And so, just a little plug there. But regardless, I definitely reach out to Emily. And Emily, I just thank you for always being there. Whenever I need you, you're there. You're supportive. You're a friend. I feel good after I'm around you, and I just appreciate that.
Ditto.
All right. Well, thank you again, and thank you, everybody. And great to have you, Emily.
Bye, everyone.